Good afternoon, everyone. I am so thankful that we're here again to continue this conversation we've named Transforming the World Through Reflections. We've had conversations with a larger group representing diverse professions. Today, we're having a conversation involving a few of us mental health professionals. And so to begin, I would like to introduce my colleagues and myself. My name is Melissa Shepard Williams, and I'm a psychotherapist and professor. I'll introduce now Dr. Makisha Lawrence, who is in private practice, and our colleague Loretta Brazil, doctoral candidate currently at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and her master's in marriage family therapy is with a specialization in African American family studies. So I'm glad that we're here today because we need to continue this conversation about the global crisis as it relates to the pandemic and social injustice. Together, privately, we've had so many conversations about the way racism has impacted our history. And we want to continue having this discussion so that hopefully we invite others into reflection as well. Last time we met, it happened to be on Juneteenth, a very important date in the history of African Americans regarding the abolition of slavery. Interestingly, today, here we are on July 3rd, the eve of the 4th of July celebration. And, today I came across a powerful video that featured descendants of Frederick Douglass. We all know this leader in the abolition movement. And they read excerpts of his speech, the speech he gave about questioning what such a holiday would mean to a Black person. And I want to read a specific piece of it that says, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim." And here we are in the year 2020. This speech he delivered in 1852. And yet we are in the midst of worldwide upheaval because of social injustice. So I feel that this is an opportune conversation on the eve of 4th of July. As we sit here today, I'm wondering what your reflections are about that. Would you like to begin, Makisha?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I think something that we talked about prior to airing, which is that the concept of America is a wonderful concept, and it is a concept that is seen in some people's lives, but is aspirational in the lives of other people. And I think that's the part that's difficult for the people who experience the so-called promise, or have experienced some aspects of the for them to understand, is that for many people, that concept has not been fulfilled in the same way. And I think what what our vocalization right now is really around, humans just want someone else to bear witness that I don't need you to feel guilty. I need you to bear witness. I need you to not look away. I need you to acknowledge. I need you to know that these are parts of your history as well as ours. And looking away is also looking away from your history. So that's kind of what I was thinking about.
Thank you. Loretta, what are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are, anti-Black racism has been around. It started in this country centuries ago, and we're still looking at the after effects of slavery. It's in the complex trauma that most Black people experience, whether they're aware of it or not. It comes through intergenerationally. It's been proven that you can pass on trauma through reproduction, both through the mother and the father's genes. And so when you have those layering, the multi-layers of trauma, and you add it to the fact that African Americans' history started on this in this land, that there was a total disconnect from Africa, where the original people came from. You have a one population of indigenous people that have no origin other than here. So they don't have the richness of ancestral ground to stand on and to be proud of. And so it's like Makisha said, if you have no one bearing witness to the fact that you've had these atrocities happen throughout your experience and life in this land, and it just goes on without ever being acknowledged, it is just a continuous travesty. We are still facing some of the exact same things, as you said, happened in 1852, it happened in 1500s. It's happening in 2020, where there is a total disregard and a dehumanization of Black people. And no one wants to stand up and be counted and say, we're sorry that happened. I recently had a conversation with someone who said, Obama should have he should have made a point to apologize for what happened. And I said, it wasn't for him to apologize for. He is also a victim. And how is it that the victim should stand up and say, to apologize for being victimized? And that's what it seems to be, that they expect that we are going to basically forgive without being asked to be forgiven. We're just going to forgive. We're not going to remember. It's time to put slavery aside, and you can't put something aside that's still continuing. It's not post-traumatic stress disorder because we are still experiencing it, and so it goes on from there. Those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's a perfect segue for having a discussion about Dr. Joy DeGruy's constant mobilization of communities so that they become aware of post-traumatic slave syndrome. As you well said, this trauma moves from one generation to the next. It impacts the way we experience the world around us and inside of ourselves, how we interpret daily experiences. You mentioned complex trauma, and in that context, we so frequently reflect on the idea that once traumatized, in many ways, you are stuck in that moment. frozen pain. And as a people, our pain has gone unattended. No access, true access to healing opportunities. We're very good at surviving, resilient as possible. Look at all the creative things that happened in the earlier years of slavery, all these ways of escaping, not only as it relates to slavery in the US, but other parts of the world. Capoeira being such a perfect example of that, you know. But let's return to this conversation about how the pain moves from one generation to the next, and examples of how it manifests in our daily lives. Makisha, would you like to elaborate on that?
Sure. It's so funny you asked that question, and I see the body keep score behind you. So apropos. Yeah. Can you pose the question one more time, please?
Sure. I think today we have an opportunity to really unpack how this pain that moves from one generation to the next, how it manifests in our daily lives.
Yeah. So I think experientially, and in my own family, and then also working with clients, is a lot of things come up somatically. So there, we have lots of headaches, backaches, stomach aches, fatigue. I don't know how many times I've heard, I don't have no reason to be tired. But there's not a concrete reason in the forefront, but that kind of passing along of that fatigue is evident in many of us. As you said, we are very good at surviving, thriving too at some points. But I think that we think that survival is thriving. And so I think that that's sometimes hard to translate, that they're not the same thing. And that if you are experiencing chronic fatigue, is that really thriving? I think the other ways are, just in kind of these ways in which fear play a role in us as part of our adaptive processing of protection. And so fear comes up in lots of different ways, that can come up as an anxiety disorder, quote unquote. But if we think about some ways in which we were raised, then it would make sense that you'd have some hypervigilance with regard to how you navigate. So,
I'm so glad that you mentioned, in quotes, these diagnoses, because something that we are discussing more frequently, and I'm thankful for it, not only in the world of clinical work, but otherwise, because healing can be facilitated by an interdisciplinary approach, as opposed to expecting this to be facilitated only by clinicians. So I'm glad that this discourse about questioning diagnoses is coming up more frequently. If there isn't enough exploration of someone's history, so quickly, someone can jump to a diagnosis that has no true description of what's happening with a person, be it a child or an adult. So I'm really glad that, we're questioning these diagnoses and not being married to labels without exploring cultural and historical context. May there be more diverse professionals at the table when these diagnostic books are re-released, right? Um, you mentioned fear and how it just is pervasive in trauma. And also that when we do meet with another Black person, be it in therapy or otherwise, you know, the complaints so frequently are about the body, the headache, or why am I so tired, or, you know, and you reminded me of times when we've talked about how uh, for so long, you know, we have to be so busy surviving that we dismiss and sometimes don't know the depth of our injury. You know, we just keep going. I don't have time to explore what? Me? I don't go to the therapy. I don't need to go. That's not, no. You know, we just keep going. And it's been part of our history to just keep going. It's exhausting. Exhausting. Please speak to that exhaustion, Loretta.
Well, I think it speaks to the unconscious collective mind, and so basically, you know, when we consider what we've all been through, and our ancestors have gone through,
Mm-hmm.
I think when you look at it as a collective unconscious, you realize that most people aren't even aware where the pain comes from. So it's in the body, and the body is trying to speak to us. We often dismiss that because we dismiss a lot of things that are negative, that we don't want to face. You know, it's not for us to complain, those types of things. And so the more we do that, the more intense the pain grows. And that's how we pass it on to other people, because the pain turns into aggravation. You know, when you look at you continue to look at how slavery has affected Black people and other indigenous people, where there's been a profound effect of slavery, of enslavement, you see that people turn that into them, they turn it onto themselves. So it becomes internalized racism, right? So that also is from fear of being other, fear of being dismissed as other, or being invisible. So if we're constantly trying to be seen and trying to be heard, we're going to more than likely attempt to assimilate into that dominant culture as much as we can, so that we can then be whole, which is false. That's not what makes us whole, but that is the assumption. It's in the way we're taught when we're told as little kids, you know, get a good education and you can do anything with your life. Mm-hmm. Well, that's true for some. And that is an American model that is based on dominant culture's expectations of their children. We are simply trying to follow that model that does not fit our lives in the same way. Mm-hmm. So we can be educated people, and it doesn't matter what level of education you have or socioeconomic standing you have, you are still looked at as other. And so that otherness is where the tiredness comes from, because you're constantly fighting against being other. That's part of where the tiredness comes from. The hypervigilance that you talked about, Makisha, that is so prevalent in all of us, because we're constantly trying to make sure that we're safe. Is this a safe space for me to be myself? And what does that look like? You know, so if we are looking at internalized racism, it affects in the way we even engage with each other. If you ever go into a market here, like I'm in Pasadena, so you go into a market and you see another Black person, you make eye contact, but you look away. You don't want to just assume that other person is going to create a safe space for you either. And so we reject ourselves, the mirror of ourselves, in light of trying to fit into something that we're never going to be a part of. We weren't intended to be a part of that. We were always intended to be other, less than, and discarded. So you have a population of people that have been expendable since the moment the other arrived in Africa. So how do you then take that and say, I am equal to you? If projection says that you are looking at something in someone else that you want in yourself. Well, I think if we look at dominant white culture, they look at the Black person and they want to be, more than they say, like that person, because we do have endurance, we do have resilience, we do have the ability to continue when we should fail. So if you're looking at that and you look at this person, you have to understand that we are all striving to become something that we already are, and we fight ourselves against it.
So a lot of time has been used to survive, and many ways of survival include dismissing what potentials are in us, just trying to match an ideal that will never be met. You know, the systemic oppression is set up so that we don't meet those ideals. And this is not only here in the United States, it's worldwide. You know, the African diaspora suffers because of that. You spoke of safety, and, you know, we constantly harp on how the beginning of healing needs as a foundation a sense of safety. We haven't been safe. We know we're not safe. So how can healing begin? So the exhaustion is inevitable. The exhaustion is inevitable. When you talked about internalized oppression, internalized racism, immediately you reminded me of colorism as an example of it. Any of you would like to jump in with colorism?
I can speak a little bit on that. I've been in many spaces throughout my almost 60 years of living, and I have been too light to be a part of something, and I've been too dark to be a part of something. I have been too ethnic, and I have been not ethnic enough. So it is left to the eye of the beholder on whether or not you fit in. And learning to stand against that and to live in my own body and in my own features, and understand that I don't have to please anyone. I am enough as I am, and I am enriched by my own education. And that's just not a formal education, it's just education of being in life and seeing the situations that you're in and acknowledging that this isn't my space. This is where I am temporarily. And so having to do that, you know, it's amazing. Again, you know, it's everything we go through. It's amazing. The trauma that we go through in every situation has a link back to the past. Yes. And the past is slavery. That is how they were able to separate and cause dissension, was by using color. If you were lighter, you were more than likely allowed to be in the house because you looked less frightening. You were also assumed to be smarter if you were lighter because you were closer to white, and more than likely one of those slavers was your daddy or grandfather or some relation to give you a different color. So you pit people against each other the same way they do now with black and brown people, black and red people, black and yellow people, is to say, this group is better than this group. So then the groups fight against each other for position to be as close to the dominant culture as they can be. So if you look at that structure of colorism, it's a losing battle. I read something the other day that said, race is not about the color of your skin. There is only one race. The color of your skin determines dominant culture's hierarchical system. So it's a way of putting people in places where they're always dominant culture, white America or white Europeans are always on top. That is how they maintain a status. And so in doing so, they pit everyone else against each other. It's the way that even though Blacks and the Native Indigenous Americans here, or Native Americans, were pit against each other, even though they were in almost similar positions of being just run over and taken and you know, killed in masses. Mm-hmm. But they pit them against each other so that if they formed a union, who would be the minority? Who would be the one that was the underling? It would not be either of those cultures.
Right. Divide and conquer.
Yeah.
It's been in place for generations.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So colorism goes back to that. It goes back to the need to separate people so that there is not a collective.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, as I'm listening to you, I'm reflecting on, you know, how all of these things you described have really attempted against our experience of identity development. We're so busy with all that has to be done to create some sort of sense of safety that time and energy doesn't get to be invested in our identity development, in connecting with our history in a positive way, that there is more to our African history than enslavement. We don't get to have the space and time to really absorb that and be grounded in it. You know, when you talk about the ways that you have grown to relate to yourself, even in the face of colorism and, you know, being told not good enough here or there, it made me think of protective factors. And it made me think about how this issue of colorism, as worldwide as it is, in different countries, there can be different narratives about colorism, where language plays a part in the way you experience or not colorism. I know for myself, growing up in Panama, I was born and raised in Panama, as you already know. Definitely there is racism. Colorism, of course. And yet, thankfully, I was raised in a family where earlier generations went through some really horrible things, and that I learned about them because we sat and talked about them. I'm thinking of my grandmother right now. And, you know, things that were happening in the South here in the US were also happening in Panama during the construction of the Panama Canal. So I had an opportunity to learn about that history. And I also had an opportunity to hear about how she resisted, you know, absorbing the narrative that the oppressor wants us to absorb and marry. I feel that was a protective factor in my life, where, as aware as I was about colorism, she, as long as other members of my family, my parents, instilled a sense of connection with myself, of appreciation for myself. I'm not trying to say I've never been impacted by racism, but I think it's important to acknowledge such a wide range of narratives. Protective factors. What are your thoughts on that, Makisha? Especially because the two of us share Jamaican ancestry. So we have this additional layer of our African history beyond living in the US.
Yeah, it's interesting. Islands are interesting. Um, so, you know, when I remember asking my dad when I was 10, I think I was 10, I was young, but I asked him, what was my grandmother?
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, what are you talking about? She was Jamaican. And I was like, but what was she? Because she didn't look like me. She wasn't brown. And so being an American child, I was having a hard time reconciling that my grandmother um, had long black hair and very, very fair skin, because that was part of the German side of the heritage. And but in America, that it's that box. Was she white? Is what I wanted to ask him. um, and he it didn't register in
Mm.
my dad's mind. He was like, she was Jamaican. Uh, and then he pulled out letters that explained some of our heritage. So it explained where the German side came over to Jamaica. And it's sad because we can have that portion of our history go back to another country.
Mm-hmm.
But my grandfather's side, there are not a lot of records on what was going on with that side because, he was descendant of slaves
Yeah.
in on the island. So the records that are kept as inventory, not as historical documentation in terms of somebody, this is a person who lived and experienced these things. So it's a protective factor just in kind of understanding how we classify differently depending on where we live and where we grow up.
Mm-hmm.
And it also kind of in a interesting way for me makes me think of more of the collective, and trying to remember all the various ancestors
Yeah.
that are among us, that are supporting us, that we're standing on their shoulders. Um, so that's a protective factor for me. I also wanted to just piggyback on something I can't remember. Yeah, Loretta, you were saying about knowing our heritage prior to coming here. This is one of the reasons why I love dance.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the reasons that dance has been one of the ways that has taught me more about um, our diaspora than school. Uh, and one of those reasons is because I've been blessed enough to have teachers who are very in depth in their studies, and who regard it as a sacred language, essentially. And so they want to pass on the oral traditions by letting you know this is why you move your body like this.
Yes.
This is the function of this movement. So in that way, that's a protective factor for me too.
Mm-hmm. I feel that we could have so many conversations about the layers of protective factors. But as protective as they are and have been, we are not entirely shielded from racism. We're not. We're not. Um, it's just proof that this history is not all or nothing. There's so many nuances to it, and we
Yeah.
and we deserve to learn about it. We deserve to learn about it and connect with people who are uh, at different stages of this learning process so that we can hopefully come to a place of being at peace with I am African, just at peace with it, and living life and giving of our gifts freely and at peace, you know? Ah, healing, healing.
Can I
Just,
add something?
oh, go
Yes.
ahead.
Go ahead, Loretta.
I was going to say, just in being African, you know, I identify as a Black woman My mother is of mixed heritage, and it almost feels like sometimes I forget that, which means, you know, that I am also mixed, but I sometimes forget that I identify as Black because that's how I present. And rather than go through a long drawn out, oh, but she's this, this, and this is how I'm this way. I just identify as being a Black woman. But honestly, if you, you know, look at the origins of people, we're all African. And that would be beautiful to be able to say that we are one race of people, and all the others are subcultures of African, you know, but they don't, that's not how we're viewed. And
Right.
so that's not even often a choice that you're given to identify as. So I'm sorry, go ahead, Makita.
Oh, no worries. I think I wanted to kind of piggyback off of something that you said earlier, and I am blanking on it now a little bit. So give me just it'll come back.
It's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Well,
Oh, okay, here it is.
it is.
There it is.
It is.
I mean, so there's something to be said about, you have 3 women of African descent who have graduate degrees that are talking about systemic racism and colorism and all the many ways in which it shows up. And I think that sometimes those who are of the majority culture will look at us and say, well, you made it, so there's not any racism anymore.
Mm.
And so I think that sometimes that's used to dismiss, to not bear witness.
Exactly.
With regard to, yes, that is true. I am a product of much of the progress, and I am also an experiencer of the system. And it can be, you can be both. It does not have to be one or the other, but it can be both. We like a lot of things to be binary.
Either or.
In America, and as I get older, most things are not.
Interesting. It's interesting how, you know, as we mature emotionally and spiritually, we realize more shades of gray, you know, as opposed to being married to the either or way of moving in the world. You know, so I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it's connected to the conversation we were having a moment ago about colorism, you know, and how it being an example of how we have identified with the aggressor by being violent with each other this way. That too has many narratives. You know, it has many narratives. And the way you presented that, Makisha, is a perfect segue to now reflect some more on the way the oppressor has experienced this history. Because just as we have been in survival mode for as long as we've been in you know, in this situation, you know, as of enslavement, you know, there are stories they need to tell themselves in order to continue what they are doing. You know, and so you mentioned that people would point out that 3 women, such as ourselves, educated, are examples of the fact that things have improved. And, you know, what are you talking about racism? Leave that behind. I mean, could you even be here having this discussion if racism was as intense as it used to be? Those are really easy ways to minimize the history and add to the story they've been telling themselves to justify their actions, to justify the systemic oppression. In our clinical world, we call that cognitive dissonance. Let me tell myself this so that it justifies the way I move in the world. And for centuries, the oppressor has taken advantage of that so that they can feel justified in treating us as less than human. And anytime there is any level of awareness, any level of protest, the oppressor needs to up the ante, right? And so these systems become ever more sophisticated to oppress us. So they're surviving some type of fear if they have this need to up the ante. So does this suggest that there are two sides to this survival coin? Ours and theirs every time they have to up the ante with the stories they tell themselves and move down generations, just like our pain moves down generations. And I found very interesting that this amazing, brilliant author, James Baldwin, left us with words that still apply today in 2020. And I want to share this, and I'm curious about your thoughts on how this may be a way of unpacking what the oppressor continues to tell themselves in order to survive the fear of our liberation. And James Baldwin said this: I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. What might be the pain of the oppressor? What are your thoughts, Loretta?
Well, I believe that the primary pain is shadow. The shadow has two sides to it, just like oppression does. And the shadow's pain is in acknowledging the wrongdoing and coming face to face with what's happened. And when you fail to do that, it creates a soul hole, and it keeps growing. It creates this darkness, and eventually the shadow can take over in a negative way, because it has a positive side as well, because shadow is also your protector. So if you don't use it as a protector factor for yourself, and you instead use it to project and to externalize your internal pain, you are allowing the shadow to outgrow your ability to control it. So when you move in such a way through oppression, through all of the centuries of oppression and the continuance, when you can take the time and stand in someone's face that has all of the same features you do, but their skin is different, maybe their hair is different, their eye color is different, but everything else, you can look at this person and see that they are a replica of you. You're a person, they're a person. And you can look at that person and say, you are not human. When you think about that, when they decided that this race of people was not human, and we're going to use you as we do any other beast of burden, there has to be just a level that comes through all of the generations, knowing that their original people were responsible for the atrocities that have been committed against these people. That has to be a tremendous pain. And like you said, I mean, James Baldwin did say it perfectly. When you let it go, when you let go of the hate, the pain is there. How do you deal with that pain? They can't. So it's hard to let go of something that you're just not ready to manage and deal with. I can't even imagine. You have people that are allies, and they immediately see the things that are wrong, and they say, I don't know how this could happen. I don't even want to be associated with this, with my family, with my group, with my population, because they've done so much wrong in the world. Because it's not just with Black and brown people, it's everywhere. Mm-hmm. They explored they left death and destruction. So to have that level of just collective shadow and then bringing it through to their conscious, it's just got to be tremendous. You know, it's a hell of a burden to bear. And to let it go individually, people are starting to let things like that come out and say, this is wrong, and I don't want to be a part of it. And what can I do to change that? I think I mentioned to you, Melissa, that my daughter is doing anti-Black racism practice. It's called outer work, anti-racism practice. And 80%, she has over 600 subscribers, and 80% of them are white. Because people are willing to learn and to see something different and find a way not to continue this whole oppressive way of living. And I think that in itself, as you mentioned to me, Melissa, is reparation. And so when we start to look at reparation, we have to see it in a different way. It's not about each of us getting $1. It's about changing the narrative for all people so that we are standing in front of someone else and recognizing that we're all human and that we're all having one human experience. It's not different.
Yes. Yes. And, you know, may the unpacking of inherited privilege continue. Now, do we, the oppressed people of the world, need to wait until the oppressor chooses to unpack, to let go of the hate, as James Baldwin proposed, so that we can begin our healing? You know, when we are in therapy sessions, whether it's with an individual, a couple, a family, we're inviting someone to reflect on what agency they have to create healing in their own lives. Yes, we are social beings. The African proverb, Ubuntu, I am because you are. Yes. Still, don't we usually pose the question, are you going to wait until she or he or they change so that you can create peace in your life? No. So at a macro level, why would we do that? You know, with such a giant population of people that cling so tightly to hate. Let's take responsibility for our wellness. And to even be in this conversation, I would say is part of it. Yeah.
I agree. Is the importance is that we as individuals see our own worth and recognize that that change starts with us. We are all change agents. We are all capable at this moment of living to some degree in choice. And we can choose to hold on to the hatred. We can recognize that this has happened and that we do need to move forward, but it is difficult for those that are oppressed to let go because of the broken promises, the broken contracts of change, the promises of change, right? And so never knowing if that's ever going to happen, you can either choose to live in that moment of wait, I'm going to wait and see, or you can say, in spite of that, I need to do this. And so I think that's why we have this conversation with 3 women that are sitting here that have made conscious choice to educate ourselves so that we are available to other people to assist them in their healing.
Yes.
And so if we are available to help and assist in healing, then they can too help others to heal. Yeah. So then there, you know, it's that whole rule of I help 10, you help 10, and those 10 will help 10, and continuing on.
Like Makisha, you said, bearing witness. We're here to bear witness. You know, we need to witness each other's lives. It's not an option. It is what optimally living includes, witnessing each other. And, you know, for so long, mental health intervention is something that our people have found suspicious, understandably so. So we are trying to build bridges of trust and encourage people to seek support. Therapy is only one of many forms. What we need is support, period. Community. Community. Makisha, I'm wondering if this is an opportunity to share this piece of a poem that the three of us reflected on earlier today.
Sure. Pull it up. So this is a poem by Langston Hughes. It was, I don't recall when it was written. Um, looking for the one that I read you. Ah, there it is. Okay. So we were kind of reflecting on the concept of America, right? That if America's a business model or if America's a corporation, and it's selling you something, then it's selling, freedom. It's selling pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's selling be a pioneer, do it on your own. It's selling you can do anything once you come to America. And so, often what we find with infomercials is the product does not always match up to what it's advertising. And so this poem by Langston Hughes kind of reflects that. So I'll just read a small portion. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain. From those who live like leeches on people's lives, we must take back our land again. America. Oh, yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me. And yet I swear this oath, America will be.
The arts come to our rescue.
Always.
Always. Loretta, do you have some final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I would like to share that in this time, or would like to make this statement, in this time, as we all are being faced with the evidence of continued slavery and evidence of continued practices of hatred, we all have to do our own self-care. We have to take the time to give ourselves moments to breathe, to take it in, but let it out. And to not hold it so dear and close to you, but to step back from it and to see it for what it is, but also make a way so that you are safe, so that you are sane, if at all possible. And that means self-care. Find a way to have those moments to yourself without media, without the things that keep bringing all of this up and keeping to it, right? So we need to separate. And I think that that's the most important thing that all of us can do. And it doesn't necessarily require therapy to do it, but therapy is a good source to help people process when they don't really know how.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I want to thank both of you for creating space today for us to have this conversation and share it with the community, because we want to embody that purpose that compelled us into mental health work, and that is to serve and support someone's healing journey. And we are in a time of reckoning. This is such a crisis, not a new one, except for the pandemic, which we have not experienced in our lifetime, but offering us an opportunity to let this be a turning point like no other in world history. And so may we keep on going. I would love to share now words by Toni Morrison that the first time I read, wow, it really had a strong impact. And as we're living this global crisis, those words resonate. And she wrote, I know the world is bruised and bleeding. And though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art. This is a necessary chaos. May we seize the moment. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Melissa, for inviting me.
Thank you.
Before we end, I would like to invite us to do one more thing, especially because we have been talking about the resilience of our ancestors and our hope that we can be contributing to this movement from survival into thriving. So let's, in unison, say the name of an ancestor on whose shoulders we stand. Iola
Courtney.
Antoine Gibson.
Courtney Magruder.
Elise Rhodes.
Thank you.
Thank you.